Hello, I am presenting today a paper that first appeared in October 2019 CCR, Deprecating the TCP Macroscopic Model by Jamshid Madhavi and myself, Matt Mathis. I'm going to talk about two historical papers and explain why I think both are doomed by Moore's law and internet scale. Basically, that pacing will ultimately win in that window congestion control has limitations, and that superseding them will require overhauling the foundational principles of a lot of research and means that there are a lot of questions that need to be reinvestigated, reopened. And there's lots of opportunities to discover new things and to port old work. I'm mostly going to focus on the middle part of this because I think it's the most interesting and potentially controversial part of the presentation. So, Van Jacobson's landmark paper, which was presented at SIGCOMM 32 years ago, has been the foundation for most congestion control research in the production internet. I strongly encourage people to reread it from time to time. It lays out 6 key principles. I'm just going to focus on essentially on self-clock, which comes from packet conservation, that the way Seawind regulates the quantity of data in circulating in the network is a situation where data transmissions are a reflection of data that arrived in the previous round trip time. In 1997, 4 of us, including Jamshid Madhavi, Jeff Semke, and Tunis Ott, wrote a paper that was a closed-form model for the behavior of Reno congestion control. This paper won the test of time in 2008, which I responded by writing an editorial where I pointed out that the model tells you that the internet has got scaling problems and fairness problems, and that these were sort of fundamental to the way some of the algorithms worked. I was then invited to write a retrospective for the SIGCOMM 50th anniversary, which is what this presentation is about. So the underlying problem is the performance of the switch queue buffer memory. In the data center, the buffer memory is typically the hottest, most expensive, most power-hungry silicon. One vendor relayed to me a story about a switch card that they make. On one side, there's a switch chip. It's, other than having several hundred pins, it's a rather uninteresting, flat, thin package. The other side is completely covered with heat sinks for the memory, because on this particular card, the memory runs 2 orders of magnitude more power than the switch chip. The key parameter is the buffer drain time, which determines how much the buffering can smooth out the statistical multiplexing in the network. And this is absolutely crucial for the functioning internet, that the queues can absorb interleaved flows and smooth them out and deliver them. Moore's law is often stated that the speed complexity product doubles every 18 months. Where this gets us into trouble is the data link rates in the internet have been doubling every 2 years over the last 40 years about. Doubling every 2 years means that both buffer speed and buffer memory have to double. So the speed complexity product has to quadruple every 2 years. And that is faster than Moore's law. And it's not feasible to do so. And as a consequence, drain times keep falling. Modern high-performance switch chips now have on-the-chip buffers measured in microseconds. And as noted earlier, larger buffers require a huge amount of very expensive hot memory. So why do we need the large buffers? The most important point from Van 88 is actually this packet conservation, and it specifically depends on data queued at the bottleneck to clock the entire system. This works very well if the buffer holds a whole delay bandwidth product worth of data, but it doesn't really work if the buffer size is tiny relative to the bandwidth delay product. Any sort of disturbances that shifts the data, the buffer can't correct shifting the data around for more than a millisecond, more than a few microseconds. And so if they're interleaving bursts, you end up losing data and it causes problems. The fix is this BBR TCP, bottleneck bandwidth and round trip propagation time, TCP, which was developed by the TCP folks at Google, including specifically Van Jacobson, which discards packet conservation and self-clock from Van 88. It uses and replaces the self-clock by pacing, transmitting data on a timer. So the way BBR works is it measures the bandwidth of the network, and then it paces by default at the previously measured max bandwidth and does measurements by dithering the data rate up and down, up to observe max rates, down to observe min RTT, and gathers other signals. This framework is very straightforward and simple and very clear. The dynamics of BBR, how it plays with other protocols, is determined by the details of the heuristics used to dither the rates to perform the measurements. And they're sort of outside of the core algorithm. So they're easy to adapt and extend. So here's how BBR behaves in a typical industrial serving environment. If you imagine a server with a 10 gig interface facing a client with a 1 gig interface, the BBR discovers that the client's got a 1 megabit bottleneck, and the server sends data at only 1 megabit per second. It doesn't create any bursts or any queues or anything anywhere in the forward part of the network. The traffic is actually smoother than Markov at some scales, and which means you can run the network higher at higher load than you would expect from statistical arriving traffic. In a self-clock world, the server sends 10 gigabit per second bursts all the way across the network, where they arrive at the access router, where they're smoothed by the queues and the buffering and the bottleneck at the access router at the far edge of the network. If the return path is monkeying with the ACK timing, for instance, if it's got a wireless link in it of some sort, this sets up a persistent pattern of bursts on the forward path and bursts of ACKs on the return path. It only takes 11 servers through a single strand of the aggregated link in the middle of the network to start forming a queue. And under pathological conditions where all of the ACKs are synchronized for some reason, this will start losing data at only 2% load. This does not use the memory in the switches efficiently because the bursts are sort of unnecessary, but happen anyhow. So that's the point. It uses a switch buffer memory much more efficiently. BBR uses a switch buffer memory much more efficiently than self-clocked protocols, and that makes a difference to people who have a lot of expensive switches. However, for 32 years, we've been assuming that packet conservation is the right answer. And I know that there are some things that I assume that are part of my intuition about the network, which actually don't apply in a paced world. There are also a huge number of opportunities for things that only sort of work in a paced world that only sort of work in a window-based world to move to a paced world. And so there's a lot of opportunities for us. So, in conclusion, the rate squared effects in the buffer cost causes the buffers to be doomed by Moore's law, forcing small buffers, which doom self-clock protocols. And it's clear to me that some form of pacing is inevitable, that we're going to have to switch to pacing everywhere. BBR seems to be a good start, but there's a lot more work to be done, and lots of past work needs to be revisited. Thank you. Questions?